Hi guys, it's Pete aka on a retro tip and welcome to the first episode in a new series where I take a look at essential DOS games. It's been a while since I covered anything on DOS games, so I thought it'd be good to go much deeper and go genre by genre, looking at some of the best games each has to offer. This is by no means a top 10 DOS shooters list, nor is it every FPS worth playing. This will be glaringly obvious by the lack of any Doom games in the list. It's not that I don't think they're essential DOS shooters, quite the opposite is true in fact, but I feel that they're the most familiar of them all, so I'm hoping to introduce at least a few of you to some new games here. So without further ado, let's take a look at 10 essential DOS first person shooters. We may as well start where the genre began with id Software's Wolfenstein 3D. It was created by the team led by the now legendary Johns, Romero and Carmack, and released in 1992 exclusively for DOS. Published by Apogee, it was released as shareware over 3 episodes, a tactic which id also employed for future releases, with them releasing the first of the 3 episodes for free to coax people into forking out for the next 2. You play as an Allied spy during World War II and must fight your way through enemy-filled levels in an attempt to escape from Nazi prison Castle Wolfenstein. The castle is broken up into distinct levels which are rendered in 3D using an engine created by John Carmack, but sprites are 2D. Several bosses are encountered throughout the game, including a spectacular face-off with Hitler himself at the end. Wolfenstein 3D set the trend for many of the genre standards going forward. Information such as ammo, equipped weapon and health are indicated at the bottom of the screen. Health, ammo and weapons can be found strewn throughout the levels, including in hidden rooms, and can be looted from the bodies of fallen enemies. Although primitive, the music is actually really good, and varies considerably from level to level. The only way I can think of describing it is a cross between Mega Drive chip music and the soundtrack from Day of the Tentacle, although I appreciate this might not make any sense to anyone but me. Arguably there are better DOS shooters available, and considering this was so early that's of no surprise, but if you're looking to explore what DOS first person shooters have to offer, I think that Wolfenstein 3D is a great place to start, and it's still great fun. The game was a runaway success, breaking shareware records and winning awards, and surpassed any expectations id Software had regarding its profitability. Many considered Doom to be the father of the genre, which would make Wolfenstein 3D the grandfather. Its influence is undeniable, and it paved the way for the explosion of first-person shooters on PC in the early 90s, some of which we'll be looking at. Rise of the Triad was designed and published by Apogee in 1994 exclusively for DOS. The initial late 94 release was as shareware, with the full version coming a few months later in early 95. It started out as a sequel to Wolfenstein 3D and used a modified version of its engine. This idea was scrapped and it was renamed to Rise of the Triad and given its own storyline. The plot sees a special ops team called Hunt, High Risk United Nations Task Force, head to an ancient monastery on an island to halt the plans of a murderous cult who are plotting to destroy LA. Although at face value it seems like any other game in the genre, Rise of the Triad took the established FPS mechanics and built on them tremendously, pioneering several new gameplay elements which became genre standards. These include the presence of bullet holes, breakable glass, and simulated dynamic lighting. The HUD is displayed at the top and bottom of the screen, which is much more practical in my opinion. One huge difference is there are 5 playable characters from which to choose, each with their own set of strengths and weaknesses across size, agility and endurance. In addition to fighting members of the cult, the player will encounter various hazards that must be traversed, but these traps can sometimes be used strategically as they'll harm enemies as well. The levels feel far more open and have a sense of verticality about them, often taking place outside rather than in rooms or indoor corridors. Levels feature numerous breakable elements, including walls that will reveal hidden areas once demolished. Another interesting twist introduced in Rise of the Triad is the cunning techniques employed by the enemies. Some will plead for mercy if sufficiently low on health and will even play dead, and some will lie on the ground before ambushing the player when they come close enough. Some enemies can dodge incoming attacks and even steal weapons from the player. There are 13 weapons available in total, divided among 3 distinct classes: bullets, missiles and magic. bullet weapons have infinite ammo, whereas the other two classes have limited ammo. Magic weapons include the Dark Staff and an enchanted baseball bat called Excalibat. In addition to the available weaponry, there are also some mad power-ups which award the player with invincibility, the ability to fly, and even one which transforms the player into a dog. The music alternates between upbeat and slow atmospheric tones and it's pretty good, but the sound and voice effects are excellent, with enemies shouting things like "outsider" upon spotting you, and the weapons fire with satisfying gunshot sounds, particularly the pistols. Although some would disagree, I think that Rise of the Triad adds enough to the genre to be up there with the best of them. It's a DOS shooter that often gets overlooked, but one I thoroughly enjoyed back in the day and definitely recommend you give it a shot. Blakestone Aliens of Gold was released as shareware in late '93, developed by Jam Productions and published by Apogee. Again, it uses the Wolfenstein 3D engine, but closely resembles Wolfenstein and has similar gameplay, unlike Rise of the Triad. Set in 2140, the plot follows British agent Blakestone on a mission to thwart mad scientist Dr. Goldfire's plans for world domination through the use of his genetically engineered army created via experiments on alien DNA. The action takes place across 6 episodes, each containing 9 regular and 2 secret levels. There are 5 weapons at the player's disposal, including a silenced pistol befitting any self-respecting British spy. Enemies are either human, alien or mutant, and there are also friendly informants who will award the player with information or items, and keeping them alive will grant bonus points. The music isn't particularly noteworthy but inoffensive if you don't spend too much time on one level, and is like Wolfenstein 3D reminiscent of Mega Drive chip music, although I'm not a fan of the sound effects which can sound rather harsh. Unfortunately for Blakestone, it was released 1 week before Doom and was completely overshadowed. A shame, as had it been released a bit earlier it would no doubt have received a more widespread following and, although primitive compared to many others on this list, is definitely an overlooked gem of the genre. Blood was developed by Monolith and published by GT Interactive. Unusually for a game released as late as 1997, it was a DOS exclusive. It runs on the build engine created by 3D Realms and used for Duke Nukem 3D. The player controls Caleb, an undead late 19th century gunslinger and former supreme commander of a dark cult called the Cabal, who worship an ancient dark god. Although Blood seems to be set in the early 20th century, it incorporates some advanced technology in its weapons, so I'm unsure of when exactly the game takes place or how this is explained. Not only is it dark in tone, but Blood's levels have a certain dark aesthetic to them too. I'm not sure what about it is so appealing, but I love the look of it. To be completely fair, it doesn't have the greatest colour palette, but the lighting effects make up for it and work well with the darker tones. Blood is appropriately named as it's very gory, and it's a common sight to see blood splatter across the screen or decapitated heads flying about the place. The enemies you'll encounter include cult members, zombies and all manner of demonic beasts. Weapon-wise, the player starts with an appropriately gruesome pitchfork, but there are some wonderfully fun weapons to pick up, including a Tesla cannon, a magical life-draining staff, a good old-fashioned Tommy gun, and a voodoo doll that deals damage to an enemy when pricked with needles. The explosive weaponry is particularly fun, including the dynamite bundles that can either be thrown, remotely detonated or set to detonate via proximity sensors, and perhaps the most amusing being the classic aerosol cannon lighter combo. Relive your teenage years by spraying out a blast of flaming deodorant, only this time you're setting your enemies ablaze. The explosions and fire created by these weapons look great, particularly when an immolated enemy is flailing about, because they contrast nicely against the dark atmosphere of the levels. The music is appropriately sinister and actually quite subtle, although the occasional faint sound of a little girl reciting what sounds like nursery rhymes is downright terrifying. Overall, Blood is bloody hard, so you may need to drop the difficulty down a notch below your usual choice, but it's a fantastic example of a DOS shooter. It was overlooked by many back in the day, including me, as by 97 a lot of people had moved on from DOS gaming, but it deserves a place on your to play list. Star Wars Dark Forces. When I first played this game, I nearly passed out from overexcitement. I was 14 when this came out in 1995. It was a marriage of first-person shooter and Star Wars, two things that I absolutely adored. Considering it was developed and published by LucasArts, I had high hopes for Dark Forces. Prior to this, they'd become one of my favourite developers, having released numerous point-and-click adventures that sparked my lifelong love affair with the genre, and the first two games in the superb X-Wing series. So, although they weren't known for making first-person shooters, I knew this game was in good hands. Thankfully, Dark Forces didn't disappoint. You're thrust straight into the Star Wars universe with an opening crawl akin to the films, complete with a faithful rendition of the John Williams theme tune. Aside from this serving as a means to let you know this is a Star Wars game, it was an incredibly efficient way of bringing you up to speed with the game's storyline in only a matter of seconds. A quick mission summary screen pops up briefing you on your objective, and you're straight into the action blasting stormtroopers with a blaster pistol. Almost immediately, you'll pick up a blaster rifle from fallen Imperial enemies, and both this and the pistol emit red blaster fire that sounds fantastic, making shooting down stormtroopers all that more satisfying. Several other weapons can be found and used later on, including thermal detonators, which are the Star Wars universe's version of grenades. You play as Kyle Katarn, an ex-Imperial mercenary employed by the Rebel Alliance to infiltrate the Empire and steal the plans to their latest weapon, the Dark Trooper, which was a project to create enhanced stormtroopers by augmenting them with cyborg technology similar to that of Darth Vader. Locations are a mix of the familiar and the new, with levels on Jabba's ship and in the Imperial capital Coruscant. Most are indoors with the odd outdoor level, but most have a very Star Wars feel to them. The music in Dark Forces is superb. It's an original score but based on the original John Williams soundtrack, so it's quintessentially Star Wars but with that retro PC sound. This just adds to the sense that you're actually in a Star Wars story, and enhances the experience without being overbearing. The game uses LucasArts' iMuse system introduced in their adventure games, which allows the seamless transition of different music tracks when moving between areas or scenarios. The sound effects, as I previously mentioned with the blaster fire, are also excellent. Every little detail is done right, from the sound of the doors to the beeps and boops from the droids. There's also full speech. This leads to some of the most satisfying moments as you blast stormtroopers right after they say classic lines such as "Stop rebel scum." LucasArts created a bespoke engine for Dark Forces called Jedi, which added some elements that were uncommon to shooters at the time. Levels featured several floors which could be accessed in various ways, including elevators, and the player was able to look up and down, jump, crouch and swim, all abilities absent in previous games like Doom. It really was a Star Wars fan's dream, but it had a lot to offer those who are merely fans of first-person shooters, so I'd thoroughly recommend you give Dark Forces a shot either way. HeXen was released in '95, developed by Raven Software and published by id Software, and is the sequel to Heretic. John Romero is listed as the game's producer, but in a talk he gave, which I was lucky enough to attend, he said that his involvement with HeXen was strictly hands-off. As with Heretic, it uses a modified version of the Doom engine and is sometimes known as HeXen beyond Heretic. HeXen is fantasy based, with its name coming from the German word for witches, or the verb form meaning to cast a spell, which makes more sense given the context. The game's set in another realm called Kronos, and levels are spread across a variety of locations. The story follows on from Heretic and sees a second Serpent Rider, Korax, and his hordes of demonic underlings attack Kronos. 3 heroes set out to defeat him. In HeXen, the player has a choice of 3 character classes: Fighter, Cleric and Mage. Each allegedly has its own distinct abilities. The Fighter is tough and has good speed, relying mostly on close quarter attacks. The Mage uses long range spells and is weaker and slower than the other 2, and the Cleric uses a combination of melee and ranged attacks and is sort of a middle ground between the other 2 classes. I say allegedly because in practice there isn't a noticeable difference in damage threshold between the classes, although there is a small variance in movement speed. The real difference comes down to your choice of weaponry. The weapons available to the player work very differently in HeXen when compared to other DOS era shooters. Each of the 3 characters has 4 weapons, a starting weapon, then 2 weapons that use blue and green mana respectively, then a 4th ultimate weapon which is extremely powerful and uses both green and blue mana. The 3 ultimate weapons have to be built from several individual parts which are found at various points in the game. Mana can be collected in little vials found throughout the levels. The fighter uses melee weapons starting with spiked gauntlets followed by an axe, a mace and his ultimate weapon Quietus, an enchanted green sword. The mage begins the game with a wand that shoots out projectiles, with the 2nd and 3rd weapons being ice and electricity magic. The electricity magic is probably the best of the 3 third weapons, shooting out electricity from the mage's hands like Sith Force lightning. The mage's ultimate weapon is Blood Scourge, a staff that shoots fireballs. The cleric starts out with a melee weapon too, a mace, and then the serpent staff, which has the best design of all the game's weapons in my opinion. Its head looks like 2 snakes biting a huge green eye, which periodically blinks. The cleric then gets a flame spell followed by what is easily the best ultimate weapon, the Wraith Verge. The Wraith Verge is a staff with a huge cross at the end which fires out swarms of devastating ghosts. In addition to looking awesome, these can rip large numbers of enemies to shreds, which can be a literal lifesaver later in the game. Modifications to the Doom engine include the addition of moving walls, the ability to look up and down, and most notably it popularised the hub system in first-person shooters. This saw the introduction of a central hub level from which the side levels could be accessed, and through which the player must travel to solve certain puzzles, which may require the use of keys or switches. Eventually a boss is encountered, and once defeated access to the next hub is granted. The music is like an upbeat 90s version of something that would be at home in a 15th century monastery, which fits the theme well, and being CD based it's pretty decent. Given its fantasy theme, HeXen stands out from any of the other first person shooters at the time and adds a little extra replay value with its character classes. Definitely one to track down if you're interested in something a bit different. It's time to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of gum. Duke Nukem 3D was developed by 3D Realms, formerly Apogee, and published by GT Interactive in 1996. It moved the Duke Nukem series away from the platforming genre and made it a 3D first-person shooter. Created using the build engine mentioned earlier with Blood, Duke 3D sees the titular Mr. Nukem battle his way through LA to take on an alien invasion of Earth. To be honest, the plot is pretty thin, but the over-the-top cinema style, humour and fast-paced action more than make up for this. Duke 3D took the established FPS format and turned everything up to 11, especially regarding the humour. The game doesn't take itself seriously at all, which is a major part of its charm. The police in the game have been turned into pigs and have LARD on their uniforms instead of LAPD, and Duke has some brilliant one-liners, many of which are lifted from classic films including Alien, Jaws and Evil Dead. And the pop culture references don't stop there. Little nods can be discovered throughout the game, from Indiana Jones's corpse to a destroyed T-800 from Terminator. Even the game's box art, which is awesome, is a parody of the cover of Army of Darkness. Duke will dish out lines more frequently than Arnie, and there are some nice quotes specific to certain situations, like when he discovers a Duke Nukem 2 arcade machine and says, "I don't have time to play with myself." He clearly does have time for strippers though, as there's a strip joint in the first level that lets you offer money to the dancers in exchange for a flash of their tasselled fun bags. Not only does he take the piss by taunting his enemies while blowing them away, but Duke can literally take a piss too, by using one of the many urinals in the toilets, an example of the humour many consider to be vulgar at the time. Although Duke does end up travelling into space, a fair chunk of the game is set in LA, and it does feel different to other games in the genre at the time, in that you do feel like you're in a city on Earth, albeit in the future, and it's interesting starting off outside and having to enter the buildings. Weapon wise you have the usual suspects, but also some new additions. His melee attack is a brutal kick, pipe bombs replace grenades, and there's some futuristic tech like the freeze ray and shrink ray, which reduces your enemies to a fraction of their size so you can simply squish them, and is definitely the most fun. You can also find night vision goggles and a jetpack, which is a great inclusion and helps you find otherwise hidden secrets. Medikits are also slightly tweaked for the better, in that you can collect them to use at will later on. Duke Nukem 3D does little to innovate with its audio, with sound effects that mostly sound like they're ripped from Doom, complete with the notoriously reused Doom doors, and music that isn't particularly memorable, although befitting to the individual levels. Although tame by today's standards, the crude humour and nudity in Duke Nukem 3D caused a lot of controversy at the time, with some critics claiming it glorified killing and porn, and it was even banned altogether in some countries. Sadly, with the train wreck that was Duke Nukem Forever, the good name of the series has been somewhat marred in recent years, but Duke Nukem 3D was instrumental in popularising the genre back in the 90s, along with the trend-setting Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. This one should be near the top of your list to play if you haven't already. Hail to the king, baby. Redneck Rampage came out in '97, developed by Zaytrix Entertainment and published by Interplay. Again, it uses the build engine. This game is best enjoyed if you go into it with an open mind. Don't expect the best gameplay mechanics in the genre, but instead enjoy the humour of the game and the fact that it doesn't take itself seriously. If you thought Duke Nukem 3D was ridiculous, Redneck Rampage is something else. Not that I mean to put the game down, it's brilliantly absurd fun. Everything about it is tongue-in-cheek play on Southern American stereotypes. Set in the fictional town of HeXen, Arkansas, the story follows two brothers, Leonard and Bubba, fighting their way across town over 14 levels to not only rescue their prize-winning pig Bessie, but also foil an alien invasion. You take control of Leonard, and a level is completed when you whack your brother Bubba with the crowbar. Enemies encountered include aliens, obviously, and clones of the hillbilly townsfolk. In addition to a crowbar and an arsenal that would be present in any self-respecting redneck stash, the player has some absolutely ridiculous weapons to use. The highlights have to be a crossbow that fires sticks of dynamite, an alien arm gun, which is literally an alien's arm operated by pulling on a tendon, and the rip saw, which is dual purpose, not only ripping enemies to shreds at close quarters, but shooting out spinning blades for ranged attacks. Power-ups are equally mental. Various foods and booze can be found and consumed, but any benefits come with a downside. Drinking booze grants the player with a health boost and increased damage resistance, but affects coordination. The level of intoxication is indicated on an alcohol meter on screen, and high levels of drunkenness result in a complete inability to move her in the desired direction. Eating food can reduce the alcohol meter, but will in turn increase the gut meter. The higher the gut meter, the more frequently the player will fart, making sneak attacks increasingly difficult. The only power-up that has no ill effects is the Moonshine, which gives you increased speed before completely resetting the 2 meters. While all this is very silly, it does add a nice strategic element to the gameplay, as collecting power-ups can be a trade-off, so unlike most DOS shooters, their use is to be carefully considered. The music is actually excellent, with a soundtrack from bands that cross rock, punk and country music in a way that just suits the game perfectly. So like I said, don't expect anything groundbreaking with Redneck Rampage, just a good laugh. The year was 1996 and id Software had looked at what had been achieved in the genre since Doom and said, okay, let's show everyone we're still the kings of the first person shooter. The result was Quake. Quake was published by GT Interactive and ran on the entirely new Quake engine, which built on the capabilities of the Doom engine in several ways, with advancements like real-time 3D rendering and the use of voxels to create proper 3D objects for the weapons and power-ups. The plot surrounds the Slipgate, a government-designed teleportation device. A mysterious enemy has connected its own teleportation system to the Slipgate in order to infiltrate the human dimension from its own. The player character Ranger must battle his way across numerous dimensions via the Slipgate or magical portals in order to collect the magic runes which will be instrumental in defeating this extra-dimensional being. The action takes place over 30 levels split between 4 episodes, and like the previous year's HeXen, has a hub world from which you can select your episode and difficulty level. The levels have a very dark and gothic / satanic feel to them, comprised mostly of caves and dungeons. The music, composed by Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails, is equally sinister, albeit minimalistic. I realised that this subtlety is what they were going for, with atmospheric sounds and low-key tones setting the mood, but I prefer the soundtrack from the Doom series, although perhaps it's unfair to compare them. Having said that, the sound effects are a huge step up and feel far more three-dimensional. The Quake engine provides a world that feels truly three-dimensional too, and adds a welcome sense of fluidity to the player's movements. Quake's selection of weapons is somewhat modest compared to some of the more fanciful arsenals we've encountered on this list, but they're satisfying nonetheless. The melee weapon is an axe, but this has very little practical value as ammo for the early weapons like the shotgun is plentiful. The highlights are definitely the nail guns and the Thunderbolt, which is the last weapon you'll collect, and shoots out devastating bolts of electricity. Be careful using it in and around liquids though, as the consequences can be fatal. Where Wolfenstein 3D and Doom popularised the first person shooter, Quake did so for the multiplayer deathmatch. Although it wasn't the first to have a deathmatch mode, it was the first to be considered competitively. Personally, I had very little experience with multiplayer gaming on DOS back in the 90s, but nevertheless its influence is undeniable. The last game we're looking at is Shadow Warrior, developed by 3D Realms on their Build engine and published by GT Interactive in 1997. It stars Lo Wang, a bodyguard for Japan's most powerful company. When he discovers that the company's president plans to take over the world by enlisting creatures from the quote dark side, Lo Wang renounces his position and endeavours to prevent this from happening. The developers wanted Shadow Warrior to be everything that made Duke Nukem 3D great and even exceed it. To this end, later in the development process they added more tongue-in-cheek humour, seeing as it went down so well with fans of Duke 3D. This worked out really well, as Lo Wang has some great quotes that rival even Duke himself, and personally I think I even prefer them overall. The sheer number of great lines this guy has is astounding. Not only does he have a massive list of one-liners, but each weapon also has its own set of zingers that he uses when picking a specific weapon up or killing an enemy with it. Seriously, look up Shadow Warrior quotes online and you'll see what I mean. The CD quality sound not only allowed for full speech, but some decent sound effects and some exceptional Eastern inspired music that, although subtle, really fits the theme. In fact, it could well be my favourite soundtrack of the lot. One letdown of Shadow Warriors, I think they missed a trick with the enemy types. They're just various types of demons and zombies. Admittedly, some have a samurai-ish look about them, but I felt like we'd seen the whole demonic hordes thing before numerous times and would have preferred a fresher set of enemies based on the Japanese theme, like actual ninjas and samurai. Where the game excels is with its selection of weapons. As you'd hope, Lo Wang has a katana and shuriken at his disposal, but has some of the more expectedly more generic weapons too, like twin Uzis and a grenade launcher. The best of the bunch are undoubtedly the most unique, the body parts that can be harvested from fallen enemies and then used as weapons. The heart dropped by one enemy type can be squeezed, producing a spectral version of Lo Wang who shoots enemies with a railgun with pinpoint precision. The other, the head, which is taken after killing the Guardian enemies, shoots deadly fireballs from its eyes. Shadow Warrior was also the first game to introduce sticky mines which will latch onto an enemy or surface when thrown, and when haven't they been a laugh? These weapons not only look unique and pretty gruesome, but just feel brilliantly fun to use. The levels are hit and miss. A lot of them have an appealing Japanese aesthetic about them, but equally there are levels that seem rather dull and uninspired. All in all, different aspects of Shadow Warrior are better and worse when compared with Duke Nukem 3D, and it's a pity that Shadow Warrior isn't as well remembered, as it was overshadowed by Quake's engine at the time. Still, nobody can argue that it's an absolute blast, even if it's for the gaming equivalent of a one-night stand. So those were 10 essential DOS first person shooters. Let me know in the comments which DOS shooters are your favourites, and keep an eye out for the next episode in my essential DOS games series. And as always, thanks for watching.